Hello, I'm James Wilson from the Philosophy Department. I'm the curator of this final week of Inspiring Minds, which is focused on the theme of imagining better futures. This week focuses on thinking about the future from an interdisciplinary humanities perspective. Our main question has been, how do we think more imaginatively and more rigorously about the future? The week's partly inspired by the strange circumstances we find ourselves in as a result of the pandemic, but we've also looked more broadly and more deeply than this. One reason for trying to think differently about the future is that it's often difficult to properly understand and assess the particular moment you're in and the possibilities for change while you're still inside it. It's all too easy to end up putting too much weight on something that turns out to be a fad, or alternatively, to fail to see the implications of incipient changes that don't fit our current presuppositions. So the week's taken a sideways look at the future and how to think better about the future. On Tuesday, we had a reading group and discussion about time, progress, and the nature of temporal experience, all inspired by the work of the novelist and critic John Berger. Among other things, we talked about whether longer lives are always better lives, the kinds of time consciousness associated with totalitarianism and with the resistance to totalitarianism, and also whether transcendent moments can redeem an otherwise painful life. Yesterday was a rich discussion on time, embodiment, and understanding across boundaries and the power of speculative fiction, all inspired by the Alien Contact movie, Arrival. Today's event brings not only Imagining Better Futures Week, but also the Inspiring Minds programme as a whole to a conclusion. We'll be looking not only to the future of the humanities, but also to the future of the university and to the role that humanities should play in politics. So during the event, please feel free to ask questions during using the Q&A button on your toolbar. And I'm delighted that Professor Maurice Biriotti, who's chairing UCL's inquiry into the value of the humanities, who's going to be our panel chair this evening. Maurice is chair of medical humanities at UCL and visiting professor at Yale University. He combines these roles with his day job of being chief executive of the strategy consultancy SHM Productions, which uses ideas and techniques from the humanities to advise businesses and the public sector on innovation and competitive advantage. So I'll hand over to Maurice now as chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James, and welcome everybody. I hope you're going to enjoy this session. I'm really looking forward to it because it's touching on themes that are very dear to my heart. As James said, I am a professor at UCL, but I also run a business, and that business uses ideas from the humanities to try and help solve problems out there in the world. And I believe passionately in the applicability of the humanities. I've made a career out of it in lots of different ways. And there's a strange thing that happens with the humanities. It's rather curious that those of us who work in the humanities, I think we're all aware that our work often feels like it's connected to absolutely everything. So you're reading a newspaper, or you're having a conversation with your mum, or you're looking at the weird results in some election in a foreign country, and the work that we do seems to be fundamentally connected to it in some way. And you might say, what's so strange about that? Well, what's strange about that is that people outside the humanities often think the exact reverse. They think that what happens in the humanities is happens in some sort of ivory tower. It's got no connection to the real world in quote marks. It's not in any way linked to things that are going on outside universities. And as a result, periodically, there are these raids on the humanities that happen. And actually, if you follow the news quite carefully, you'll see that in various countries around the world, and even in this country, there are battles going on to do with, hang on a second, should we be encouraging so many people to do humanities subjects? Should we be investing in the humanities so much? Shouldn't we be closing down some of these departments? Haven't we got too many of them? Shouldn't we in some way be putting more of our effort into things that, quotes, matter, like STEM subjects, etc.? Some time ago, a group of us, and I'm happy to say that James is part of the panel that's working on this, and so is Lee, who you're going to meet. A group of us started to think, well, hang on a second, maybe we ought, particularly in these rather troubled times that we're in, we ought to think about what UCL's view is on this. We ought to think about what is the value of the humanities. Now, this is not exactly the first time this has been done. There have been lots of attempts to do this. We're hoping to do it differently. Maybe that's arrogant, I don't know. But this event, in a way, is, for me, part of that. I know it's part of another series, but it's part of that process, if you like, of thinking about what's the role of the humanities in the world. How do we continue to think about how the humanities interact with the world? And yes, you might say this has been done before and lots of people have done it before, but the world is changing and the humanities are changing. And it's a good moment for us to reflect on this. So I'm really delighted that I'm going to be hearing from some of my colleagues about how their work connects to some of the big questions that there are out there in the world. And I've had a bit of a sneak preview of all of the presentations, and I have to say it's mouth-watering stuff. It's incredibly exciting. I find it incredibly exciting. I can't wait to hear it. And I hope you're going to enjoy it too. The way this is going to work is I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak just for a few minutes about their work. I'll do a brief introduction to them before they come on. If I get it wrong, guys, I'm really sorry. It's what I was given, so I know these introductions can be a bit weird, so I'll do my best anyway. If I get it wrong, whatever. But you're all very distinguished. That's the main thing people need to understand. Then we'll hear from each of the panelists all the way through. If you have comments, please use the chat. If you have questions, please, as James said, use the question Q&A bar in here. Use that function. Make sure that you're giving us those questions, and we'll try to come to those questions. But once the panelists have spoken, I think I'll try and get a bit of discussion going amongst the panelists, and then we'll see if we can cover off questions from the audience as well. So if that's okay with everyone, I'm going to just ask our first speaker to speak, and that's Emily Baker, who is a lecturer in comparative literature and Latin American studies, which is actually a subject I used to teach like 150,000 years ago. She's in the School of European Languages, Culture and Society, and her research explores the way that cultural producers recast historical events in fiction to shed light on their concerns in the present. And as I think about that, I can think of no more relevant way to start the conversation. So Emily, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Maurice. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this final event. So I organised the climate emergency event during this induction season. And in many ways, that week kind of coalesced in the roundtable, which ended with this kind of obsessive questioning, really, precisely about the role of humanities that Maurice is talking about. And so my talk, in many ways, kind of just builds upon what he's saying and perhaps relates it to the climate emergency a little. So I'd like to talk about the humanities really as a function of relentless curiosity. The humanities to me mean the urge to ask life's most important questions, the drive to find and evaluate diverse perspectives, the courage to take a position, and the need to find the best way to communicate or share that position to or with others. This may well be through, indeed, inspiring their relentless curiosity. So curiosity is derived from the Latin curiosus, which can mean careful, diligent, inquiring eagerly, meddlesome, and is also said to be akin to cura, care. So the word itself is not only referring to diligence and eagerness to know, but also meddlesomeness, the desire to get involved, not forgetting the crucial reference to care, which implies an ethical orientation towards the other, or a mutually constituted exposure, or a love ethic, but I'll come back to that at the end. So where did I attempt to direct my curiosity in relation to this session? Well, the important question I wanted to ask was, how do what we do in the arts and humanities connect to or inspire real world change in relation to phenomena such as the climate emergency? And so for the purposes of formulating my position, I dipped into, read or reread the following text. Jason W. Moore's Capitalism in the Web of Life, Timothy Morton on Queer Ecology, Warwick Mule's With Nature, Jean-Luc Nancy, Literary Communism or Communivirus, another article, Frederick Jameson on Cultural Studies, Kant's The Conflict of the Faculties, John Berger, Go Ask the Time, Sarah Ahmed on the Cultural Politics of Emotion, Giorgio Agamben on the Contemporary, Borges, The Library of Babel, Hannah Arendt on the Human Condition and Truth and Politics, Clarice Lispector, The Passion According to GH, Tony Robbins on the 6 Human Needs, Andrew Oswald on the link between income and happiness, Michael Stone Richards on care, Bell Hooks, All About Love. And this is still only really a selection of the kind of myriad of different texts and sort of texts that I was looking at as I was investigating this question. And you'll recognize many of the texts that we have read as part of the Inspiring Minds season that I was exposed to through this very UCL Arts and Humanities community building initiative. The Borges story, which Tim proposed for his session, the Byrd text, Ahmed that was suggested by Natasha for gender and sexuality, Zine's session on the matter of Black lives provoked me to look again at the Bell Hooks quotation that I love. Other suggestions were from conversations that carried on beyond the bounds of these events. Florian emailed me to recommend the Agamben chapter following the climate emergency short story session. Tim told me to look at Arendt for links between political thought and action following the Roundtable. I'm teaching Clarice Lispector in my life writing module at the moment. And this all goes to show that the humanities is a relational space that encourages encounters between people and texts and the constant discussion of and circulation of perspectives. The power of it comes from the unboundedness of this community and the fact that this process of reading, discussion, opinion formation, and action can be applied to any sphere of life, whether it's the climate emergency, political elections, coronavirus protection, or what to have for dinner. Of course, I don't have the time or space to explain what I learned from all of these readings, and not all of them have informed the position that I took with regards to the question. But in the process of doing it, I have a renewed sense of connection to the humanities community, my colleagues and students, thinkers of the past and present, and inspiration in my calling as a kind of scholar and learning facilitator at UCL. So the position I take is this: the arts and humanities are vitally necessary as an unbounded community of curious people who use judgment to evaluate different positions, to formulate opinions and create stories that expose structures of domination, inequalities, and imagine possible futures that would otherwise remain abstract or opaque. So Jason W. Moore, author of Capitalism in the Web of Life, states the following: crises are not easily understood by those who live through them. The philosophies, concepts, and stories we use to make sense of an increasingly explosive and uncertain global present are nearly always ideas inherited from a different time and place. The kind of thinking that created today's global turbulence is unlikely to help us solve it. End quote. In other words, the way we think shapes the way we respond. And we need, in many ways, to keep having conversations and keep creating spaces in order to be able to transcend the context in which we think and constantly reevaluate the tools we use to think. The way we think thoughts matters. So linking this again to action, when we take political action with regard to something like the climate emergency or a political election, we have to practice what Arendt calls disinterestedness, which doesn't mean a lack of interest, but a detachment from our own personal interests. And we have to use our imagination that allows us to see the situation as far as possible from multiple perspectives. Jean-Luc Nancy, who in many areas builds upon Arendt's thought explicitly, though not explicitly here, talks about comparence, a wordplay that distinguishes this word or concept from comparison. Comparence places emphasis on the limits with which we can know or imagine other people's perspectives. But comparence is where we meet, each at this limit of understanding, he says in a piece called Literary Communism. He says the following about this limit. So, quote, the call that convokes us, as well as the one we address to one another, at this limit can be named, for want of a better term, writing or literature, end quote. So here he's emphasizing precisely the importance of reading and writing in forming this unbounded ethical community. Not just imagination, but informed imagination, which is also something that Arendt is sort of touching upon in other ways. So to finish, I want to quote at length from All About Love by the African-American feminist activist and scholar Bell Hooks that I had as a reading at my wedding. It made everyone laugh because at the beginning, it's not very wedding at all. And our friend read it really dramatically with a huge frown on her face. So I start the quotation. In our society, we make much of love and say little about fear. Yet we're all terribly afraid most of the time. As a culture, we're obsessed with the notion of safety, yet we do not question why we live in states of extreme anxiety and dread. Fear is the primary force upholding structures of domination. When we're taught that safety lies always with sameness, then difference of any kind will appear as a threat. When we choose to love, we choose to move against fear, against alienation and separation. The choice to love is a choice to connect, to find ourselves in the other, to live our lives based on the principles of a love ethic, showing care, respect, knowledge, integrity, and the will to cooperate. We have to be courageous. Learning how to face our fears is one way we embrace love. Our fear may not go away, but it will not stand in the way. Those of us who have already chosen to embrace a love ethic, allowing it to govern and inform how we think and act, know that when we let our light shine, we draw to us and are drawn to other bearers of light. We are not alone. End of quote. So, as a humanities community, let us embrace difference, have and inspire relentless curiosity, reveal and denounce structures of domination, embrace a love ethic, and let our disciplinary lights shine so that we draw to us and are drawn to other bearers of light.
Emily, I can only really thank you on behalf of everyone for what can only be the sort of most spectacularly appropriate and excellent start that one could imagine. So thank you very much for that. I spend most of my life, as I was saying before, outside the academy, bringing humanities ideas to different people. Sometimes I don't even know that's what I'm doing, in lots of different contexts, in business and government, etc. And I know that in a way your address there was a plea for people in the humanities to reach out and to find ways to embrace difference and to communicate with others. But I wish that many of the people I work with day to day could have heard that, so that I could have made a plea to them to embrace the humanities, because I can't think of a better advertisement for it. So many thanks for that. We're going to go on to our next speaker, who another very distinguished speaker, Tim Beasley Murray. Now Tim is actually chairing one of our groups in our commission, or our inquiry into the value of the humanities, and he's looking at the relationship between research in the humanities and teaching and learning, and the value of teaching and learning in the humanities. And one of the reasons why it seemed like a good choice for him to do that is because he's just very passionate about it, and I'm sure that will come across in the conversation we're about to have with him. He's an associate professor of European thought and culture. He works on literature and philosophy across French, German, Czech, Slovak, and English language cultures. I think, I seem to remember once having a coffee with him, and he rattled off the languages that he spoke, and then Italian wasn't one of them, and then he just started speaking to someone in Italian as if it was a language he couldn't speak at all. Extraordinary talent. Anyway, he's the curator and academic director of the Inspiring Minds series of events, and he's the director of the PhD program in creative critical writing, and the academic director of the new, very exciting Creative Humanities BA that's going to launch in 2023. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Tim.
Thank you so much, Maurice. Thank you everybody for coming. Maurice's introduction was extremely flattering and not entirely true, but I'll take it. Emily, I really don't know what to say. I think we can all go home now. The job is done. It's very hard to follow. We talked before in our pre-match chat about this being a relay race. We definitely send our strongest runner out first. James asked us to relate this to the research that we're doing, and I'm just putting the final touches, writing the introduction and conclusion to a book manuscript. And in many ways, this book manuscript, at least the first 25,000 words of it, is precisely about this, is about the nature of academic activity in the humanities. And I did a rather poor thing. I tried to sort of condense that 25,000 words into a text this afternoon, and of course it totally failed. So what the comments I'm going to have to say will be a little bit, on the hoof. But the thesis of this book, the book is called The Risk of Real Life, Games, Criticism and Literature. And the thesis of this book is there's an important and productive but unsettling analogy that exists between games and literature on one hand, the literature place where we play games and we allow us to play and create, but I'm not going to talk about that now, but also criticism, academic activity in humanities, that somehow what we do is like a game. And as I say, this can be something that's productive, but it also could be something that troubles and unsettles us. And here I want to sort of contradict a little bit what Maurice was saying right at the beginning. Maurice was saying, yes, there are connections between what we do in the humanities and so on, between things around us, and we automatically feel we have a way into them. But on the other hand, what the enemies tell us is partially correct. There is a separateness to what we do. There isn't a way in which the academy, whether we use the meta of the ivory tower that I discuss in the book or other ones, is some separate sphere that you have to enter through special gates. You have to adopt a certain language, the arcane terminology of academic activity in the humanities or of criticism, where we do things in a different way, where we, for example, separate off the ordinary pleasures of ordinary reading from the very austere and unpleasurable sort of reading that we do in the humanities as academics, professional reading, or rather where that pleasure might be some sort of special jouissance that is only got to by some special gate, some process of initiation, and itself may involve pain, right? So there is, as I say, this sense that we exist in a separate sphere. Now, how do we get from there to games? Well, the primary notion of game that I look at in my book comes from the Dutch writer Johan Huizinga in the 1930s in his book Homo Ludens. And he talks about the definition of the game as it separates us off and makes us perhaps lose that connection of what is real, what really matters. Because the point about the game is at the end of the 80 minutes, you know, where you've been bashing people to bits on a rugby field, nothing really matters. It's just the game. At the final whistle, you shake hands, right? So we have in our experience of academia in the humanities, I'd argue, this worrying sense that it's just a game, right? That it doesn't matter. Here we get this double sense, like the double sense of Emily's Curious, the double sense of academic. Academics means really profound and serious and more important than the trivial nature of everyday life. By the way, trivial has that same connection there. It comes from the trivium, which was what was really important in the academic syllabus of the Middle Ages. But it's also just academic. It doesn't matter. It's just an academic question. So, I mean, I could talk for another sort of 24,000 words, and I'm not going to do that. But I guess the question that I want to put to us is, how can we deal with that structural ambiguity in what we do? That what we do is so important because it's about playing and invention and making up new rules and doing these things we can't do in everyday life. And that's where an incredible strength of the humanities is, this place of imagination and defamiliarization and all those sort of things. But how do we also account for the fact that that very nature of what we do is what separates us, what makes us sort of powerless, what makes it just academic, right? Now in the book, and this is the conclusion I'm trying to write, I have some suggestions about that. I think it's about really taking risks. I think it's about courage. Yeah, in games, in rugby, we could take risks, but they don't matter. And that's a little bit like academia. It doesn't really matter. But how can we take real risks? How can we step outside the boundaries of play, right? The pitch, and really intervene. And I think it's about courage. And I also think it's about investment of self. I mean, Emily, I was very moved where you just mentioned your wedding and the poem, the text that was read at it. You were in that as a person and all that goes along with that. And I think very much, you know, when we play a game, we're a fly half or a hooker or a prop. We're just some interchangeable game player. Whereas when we do more than play, we actually come to what we do with the whole of our being, right? And maybe it's about risk, it's about courage, and it's about speaking from that place, right, as human beings. But yeah, that's really what this isn't really about the future. I guess it's about the value of the humanities and the structural ambiguity that I think somehow is something that faces us as a challenge. But in that very game-like playfulness of the humanities, there's also a possible response. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I love the way, like a computer game yourself, you sort of disappeared at a certain point and went into a sort of weird glitch. So thanks for that. It was all very dramatic. And I guess, I mean, and I loved your contradiction of my point, because of course you're right, and that you built your whole argument around, in a sense, a slightly, not necessarily contradictory, but a slightly different view. I guess the only interesting thing that I would say, as someone who spends his life in a little bit in academia, but a lot in lots of other fields, is that the other fields also feel like that, and feel like they are walled spaces that are a little bit removed. And that is true of groups of bankers that I work with, and groups of civil servants that I work with, and groups of senior doctors that I work with. And they all have their own little language and their own little sense that they worry about what their relationship is with the rest of the world. So there are, and that's, it's true of almost every other sphere that I interact with. It's one of the things that makes what I do fun, but also quite frustrating. I think the strange thing about humanities scholars, and now I'm going to say something about you, you're immediately going to tell me this is not true, but I'm just telling you as someone who interacts with other people a lot, is that you're in a game and just very slightly more likely to talk about the game that you're in than other people are to talk about the games that they're in. And that in itself, I think, is quite interesting. And in a sense, both of our speakers have just done that rather eloquently. Anyway, I'd like to go on to our next speaker, but thank you for that, Tim. I thought it was splendid. Our next speaker is Benedetto Rossi, who's going to talk to us about a topic that is deeply important and has been for all of my lifetime and since before then, but has come into sort of central view recently in a way that's very profound, and I think has affected everybody. She's an associate professor in the history of anthropology of Africa, and her work focuses on 20th and 19th century African social history with a predominant focus on slavery and other forms of unfreedom, labor, migration, plan development, gender. She is the author of From Slavery to Aid, Politics, Labor and Ecology in the Nigerian Sahel, 1800 to 2000. And she holds an important grant looking at African abolitionism and the rise and transformations of anti-slavery in Africa. So I'm really looking forward to what she has to say, because I think this is a connection with a topic that, as I say, has always mattered, but matters very importantly at the moment. Benedetto.
Thank you so much, Maurice, and thank you everybody here for the really stimulating ideas that I've already heard. And I think the few words I want to say are actually, I'm going to try to reconnect to some of the bigger themes that have been raised. So, in what ways have humanities influenced my work on slavery? Now, I think in a very general sense, rather than in a sort of much more specific and detailed sense that Emily has highlighted by looking at particular authors. I think generally it, coming from a humanities background has forced me to question those ideas that are taken for granted. And it's hard to say it in other ways. I'm sure this sounds very simple, but this sense of questioning the most taken for granted axioms, both of our times and of the past, including those things that feel perfectly familiar to myself. And so one of the things I've mostly been interested in is the notion of exploitation. Now, what is exploitation? Exploitation, everybody might think exploitation is just, it's something bad. But in fact, as one works historically and looks at the past, we're forcing ourselves to ask, when do particular practices come to be seen as exploitative? And it's not at all an easy answer. Why do they come to be seen as exploitative? By whom? And with what consequences for whom? And although the ground where we are standing is one where we take abolitionism for granted, for the greatest part of human history, slavery has been seen as a legitimate institution. Slavery has been accepted as ethically, morally, and religiously legitimate, and not as a moral aberration, which is how we think of it today. Even a moral philosopher of the standing of someone like Seneca In some of his moral texts, he actually accuses certain persons who do terrible things to slaves, to enslaved young boys, not of the kind of things that we see as wrong in what they're doing, but in completely different things, such as being intemperate. So the question of, when does slavery come to be seen as a moral problem, when in fact history is filled with theories that justify slavery, natural slavery, on natural grounds, or in terms of a just war, or in terms of enslaving people from other religions who might allegedly do more harm than good, or perhaps slavery as punishment for terrible things like crimes or debt. So the history of humankind is lustricated with pro-slavery ideologies that actually were respected and respectable persons who thought of themselves as profoundly moral, supported slavery and didn't think of it as a moral problem. And today we take an abolitionist stance, which is the opposite. The very fact of naming a practice as slavery, of arguing that there have been cases of enslavement today, naming it means denouncing it, means calling for a total and complete lack of tolerance, for immediate intervention. He or she who names a practice as slavery is actually self-arrogating to him or herself an enormous power to intervene, because who would question that slavery must be ended? It has been abolished worldwide. It's perhaps one of those issues on which there is greatest global consensus on. Slavery is now abolished in every country of the world, although it is not criminalized in every world country. And what I want to say in the next sort of 2 minutes is certainly not that slavery is a good thing. And here I want to be very, very clear. And that is what's complicated about taking a perspective that comes from a background in the humanities, and so questioning your own truths, but then and trying to understand historical perspectives and different rationales on their own grounds, and at the same time believing very strongly that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. Now, how do you reconcile that genuine effort to question axioms, your own axioms, not the trivial ones, but the big ones, axioms such as there cannot be any tolerance for slavery, and at the same time try and understand a different perspective, try and provide an interpretation of a perspective of someone who feels morally legitimate and at the same time justifies slavery. Now, first of all, 2 points. I think on the one hand, a humanities perspective teaches us to always scrutinize those discourses that tend to be venerated at a particular time, that are not addressed critically, that are not questioned because they come to be seen as dogmas, as axioms of the time. Now, we know, it's very easy to study that abolitionism has actually been used to legitimize the occupation of the entire continent of Africa at the end of the 19th century by European empires and imperialists who argued that slavery was continuing in that continent and that it couldn't possibly be tolerated. So they acted as liberator, and in an action that, in their intolerance for slavery, they arrogated to themselves an enormous power that justified colonial occupation. So on the one hand, we can never take anything completely for granted. We cannot. We must always scrutinize critically. Something that may appear as inherently good may be instrumentally used for ends that in the end may turn out to be imperialistic and questionable. The second point is what happens to our respect for difference? What happens to the wonderful ideals that Emily talked about, to the quote of bell hooks, when the different is a slaver? These are the difficult questions. And these questions have been extremely difficult for me because when I was a PhD student, I actually worked in a society where there are persons who are currently enslaved and they call others masters. And these masters have the power to take their children away from them and sell them. This is a real problem until today in the Sahel, in the West African Sahel, in Mauritania. Those of you who are familiar with the activism of the humanitarian sort of, nowadays he's a real superstar, he won many prizes, Biram Da Abid, or the NGOs that are all abolitionist NGOs in the present, are dealing with societies where there are slave owners, their descendants, who continue to make claims on the persons and life of persons who had been enslaved. So on the one hand, a humanities perspective that is very important to me comes from the hermeneutics of Hans-Georg Gadamer and his idea that we have to see the truth in the other's perspective. To really dialogue, we must be ready to put ourselves at stake, to put our greatest truths at stake and see the truth in the other's point of view. On the other hand, how far are we prepared to go? And when does it mean when that truth questions some of our most heartfelt and strongly felt beliefs, as for me, anti-slavery? Because the closer I have been to slavery, the more I have studied it and the more I have seen it in action, and I've seen what it has done to living persons whom I know, the more I've seen that it is terrible and should not be tolerated. And that every time we talk about it and every action we take, if it can have relevance for policy and politics, then it must be against it. Now, how do we reconcile this with our good words about a humanities stance that asks us to be critical, self-critical, self-reflexive? So I'm not going to say more because I think I have more or less used all my minutes. And maybe in the Q&A, more will come up about the concrete examples that I could mention that have to do with pro-slavery ideologies and what people are doing today in Africa and in the parts of Africa that I'm most familiar with to combat against slavery. But just one word in relation to what Tim was talking about, academia as a game, academia as being just academics and not really making a difference. How do we avoid that? Now, on the one hand, I don't entirely agree. I don't know what it is supposed to mean to be just academic. I think providing an interpretation of the world is a political act. And when that is done but in order to do so correctly, we have to do it without taking a partisan stance. Because and of course that is almost impossible. A lot of my colleagues will say it is impossible. We can never erase our view. We can only tell the reader where we stand. But in fact, in providing an interpretation of what a pro-slavery perspective is, we have to try and explain where these hierarchies come from and why one might encounter, as I have encountered, persons who have been enslaved, who have been beaten as adults because they were enslaved, who have seen their parents suffered and who had their children taken away, and they would still argue that if their master, and that's the word they would use, would order them to throw themselves in a well, they would do so because God made that master there, gave the master the power. How do I understand this way of thinking unless I drop my egalitarianism and try to see it from the cultural, social, and historical perspective of those who are speaking? Now, that doesn't require justifying it politically, but as Bourdieu talks of games in a way that is slightly different than Huizinga. And I would say that the academic game has different rules and strategies than the political game. And Bourdieu has written extensively about both fields, both types of game. In the academic game, it's very important to provide an interpretation that is correct and therefore not really partisan, because otherwise it's very hard to try and explain where someone else is coming from in their own terms. But then there's other games, and we can take an activist stance where, having understood and respectfully understood a different perspective and a different sort of action, we can say where we stand when it comes to making changes to certain practices, and we can make a an informed suggestion about what we think should change, but only if that is respectful, informed, and careful. It can be based on a dialogue that eventually brings all parties a little bit further. I'm done. I didn't time myself. Sorry if it's taken long.
It's fine. We could have listened to you for longer. So Benedetto, thank you so much for that wonderful, really wonderful intervention. I think one of the reasons why I found it so wonderful was because of its sophistication. And because of, if this is a game that we're in, I'm grateful for the game. I'm grateful for being invited to the game, because it seems to me that what you just demonstrated was the possibility of a space in which we can get away from the polarizing debates that we have, in which we can actually listen to something much more sophisticated. We don't have to take one position versus another. We can take up a position very clearly, as obviously you have, but we can also understand the complexity of the world without fear of the articulation of that complexity being, if you like, used against us or willfully misunderstood. It seems to me that that's absolutely critical. And you raised something that put me in mind of something that happened to me years and years ago when I was a graduate student at Cambridge. Years and years ago, long story why, but I had dinner with, I was invited to dinner by Desmond Tutu, and I had dinner with Desmond Tutu. And I was all excited and talking to him about my liberal views and my attitudes and all the rest of it, and all the sorts of things that you were talking about. And he looked at me at a certain time. He said something that was very profoundly marked me. He said, I listen to many of you people in Europe who have this kind of an education and who do this kind of work. And I know that you do important things, but sometimes I just wonder, are you always, when you're thinking about the other, thinking about the easy other? Because I'm an easy other for you. I'm an easy other. What if the other is the slaver? I remember him saying that to me. What if the other is the slaver? Where is your respect for the other going to go then? And it had the most, I mean, obviously he was saying that from a Christian framework, but it had the most profound effect on me. I thought it was the most devastating question. And in a way, your intervention put me in mind of that in a very sophisticated way. So I have to say thank you very much for that, Benedetto. I have a feeling that our next speaker is going to pick up some of the thread of some of the things, and I'm sure she will have a different perspective. Our next speaker is Stephanie Byrd, who's Professor of German Studies, whose work focuses on the interaction of fact and fiction and the relationship of female national identities, shame. She works on comedy, she works on representations of trauma, and she's currently the co-investigator in the HRC-funded project Compromised Identities, Reflections on Perpetration and Complicity Under Nazism. So I have a feeling that in a slightly different way, we're going to approach some of those same themes, and I'm sure, knowing Stephanie, that what we'll have will be provocative and insightful. So Stephanie, over to you.
Thanks, Maurice. I don't know that I'll be more provocative and insightful than my colleagues have already been, but yes, I'm working on a project that's looking at complicity and perpetration under National Socialism. And so the other that I am dealing with in fiction, and I'm the sort of cultural critic, as it were, in a team of 4 altogether, where the other 3 are historians. For all of us, the other is very much the perpetrator particularly, but to a less extent those who were complicit with National Socialism, however that is defined, and who might also have collaborated with it. So I can offer a defence of fiction, of course. A lot of us in the humanities can, precisely along the lines that it is a game. And actually, I think games are very important. I see that with my granddaughter at the moment, who is, very seriously playing. I think play is a very serious matter. I think a lot of humour is a very serious matter. And I think what makes fiction challenging and what makes it challenging for us in the humanities is that it evokes complex, ambivalent and contradictory responses that aren't always, are often not easily reconciled with moral expectations or judgment. Fiction and play doesn't have to work in the service of an argument. Indeed, it can undermine and without replacing any sort of argument or any sort of assumption we might have. So what I'm looking at is the way, I'm particularly interested in complicity rather than straightforward perpetration, but I'm interested in how fiction might understand it in the past, but also how we interpret the past in order to understand the present, much as Emily was saying in her first contribution, and also the way fiction interrogates the assumptions on which our identities rest in the present. So I'm interested in how fictional texts about complicity and perpetration organize our emotions and channel them to ethical or political ends in the present, how fiction challenges or reinforces our expectations of complicity and justice and our understanding of representation more generally, about which fiction has a lot to say, and it often in good fiction interrogates its own mode of representation. But coming back to the whole question of to what extent are we willing to, I'm going to use the word empathize with the other. Literary representations of perpetrators that give them a voice have caused huge anxiety even in academic communities. So whether it was in 1946 with Borges's creation of an ideal Nazi in his fictional monologue Deutsches Requiem, or whether it was George Steiner's giving Hitler a voice in his novel The Portage to San Cristobal of A.H., which he wrote in 1979, or whether it was Jonathan Littell's The Kindly Ones in 2006. These authors all gave their perpetrators a voice. And indeed, Jonathan Littell makes the claim that I am a man like other men, I am a man like you, immediately drawing certainly the male reader into his, we could all be perpetrators. All these texts caused a certain amount of controversy. And also disquiet with concern expressed, and this continues into the present, with concern expressed about mythologizing evil, the seduction of identification with the perpetrator resulting in uncritical exculpation of what they've done, concerns about validating the perpetrator perspective. There's also unease around the enjoyment of the literary representation, and that it might be morally inappropriate if we read these texts that depict violent perpetrators and we get involved in their point of view. You know, I would argue that most of us, if we read to the end of a text, if we're doing it not for, for paid work, we are at one level deriving a certain amount of pleasure, enjoyment, satisfaction or interest, which I would loosely sort of put to the curiosity that Emily referred to. And there's a sense that this might be somehow morally inappropriate. And actually historians too, in their interviews, their oral history interviews with people who might have been complicit or might have been perpetrators, they're often at pains to assert their distance from their interviewee as though they might somehow be associated with or contaminated by the person they are interviewing. Now, all three of these, well, certainly Littell and Steiner defended their right to create reality as they wanted to. I'm going to quickly talk about a writer, as some of you, apologies if you've heard me talk about him before, but he remains consistently fascinating, and I would very much recommend reading everything he's written. I'm only able to read him in English and German, not in the Hungarian in which he wrote, but this is Imre Kertész, the Hungarian writer and Nobel Prize winner, who died in 2016, who after surviving Auschwitz-Birkenau as a 14-year-old boy, isn't commonly thought of as a writer interested in representing perpetrators. But his life under the dictatorship of János Kadar, who was in power in Hungary from 1956 to 1988, was also profoundly formative for Kertész. As part of his compulsory military service under the Hungarian dictatorship, he served as a prison guard. And he later wrote that it was not Auschwitz, which I suffered, that made me into a writer, but the military prison, the situation of the executioner, the perpetrator. So in his novel Fiasco, Cortés uses the figure of the executioner to point to the culpability of the society as a whole. He accuses his audience of using moral censure to silence him, thereby denying the relevance of his actions to their lives. And he insists on the significance of his account for understanding the human condition generally and for exposing the self-righteous innocence of the so-called not guilty. And he's referring here to most of the other people in a society that has gone along with or tolerated mass murder. In another novel called The Union Jack, the narrator tells of his experience of the 1956 Hungarian uprising, and his much younger students ask him about the show trials, expecting a moral response from him. But the narrator's answer is complicated and resolutely not a moral one. He tells them that in a world of lies, terror, and murder, the only truth that existed was the truth of arrest, imprisonment, execution, the shot in the head, and the noose. However, he then admits to a radical position that he has only formulated this response now that he's being asked for a response and has been obliged to attribute significance to something which has only subsequently acquired significance in the public mind, but which in the reality of those days, at least as far as I am concerned, had only very slight or an entirely different significance. He admits that the trials, the show trials under the dictatorship, had no moral meaning for him. So the narrator's experience of 1956 and his later construction of it testify to a system in which the very means by which actions and events might be morally evaluated are absent. In a world in which the only truth is that of existential threat, the very nature of choice is put into question. And at the level of daily existence, a dictatorship in which this threat exists compels collaboration. And in another work of his, where he's in conversation with an alter ego, Cortés points to the trap of complicity, referring to his need to earn money by writing comedy pieces. He says, "That's a well-organized dictatorship for you. The need to make a livelihood turned me into a collaborator. And by extension, a well-organized dictatorship will also turn individuals into perpetrators." Cortés's alter ego in this conversation remains profoundly skeptical of this approach to perpetration and complicity, claiming that this position makes it impossible to call any mass murderer to account. But Cortés is unambiguous. "You're forgetting that as a writer, I'm not concerned with calling people to account, but with accurate portrayal." So Cortés insists that an artist tells the radical truth, which has nothing to do with the normal expectations of morality, for a moralist cannot be an artist. Rather than creating a new world, the moralist judges the world in which he moves and merely recreates the status quo. Now, what is interesting is that his most recent publication, which from what I can tell is it's not in English translation, unfortunately. I've had to read, well, it's not a problem, but I've read it in German. There's a new type of conformity that he was faced with after winning the Nobel Prize and choosing to live in Berlin. And this was the conformity that he felt that he was compelled to live under because of public opinion. And there are 3 points in this latest text of his where he is blatantly Islamophobic and comes out with phrases that really are very reminiscent of the sort of war of cultures, the war of civilizations rather. And this is exactly, so not only do we have a character who was himself a survivor of a concentration camp. I mean, he was, as is so often the case, he survived only by a complete fluke. He then himself was in the position that we might or might not, but he was opt to see as being complicit as in his duty as a prison guard for a time. Certainly he explored it in that way. but finally is actually himself coming out, feels that he can no longer speak the truth. And his truth is actually to see the threat and to speak about the threat of Islam as he saw it when he's living in Berlin in the, this is after 9/11 that he comes out with these phrases. So here we're faced with not only a very interesting writer and someone who endlessly explores the problems of difference and persecution and the murderousness of the present world, but where we are in reading his works faced with our own moral expectations and assumptions. This is, I think, the strength of his work, and actually the moments where he comes out with that sort of Islamophobia is directly those moments where the reader, after, reading the Nobel Prize winning survivor of Auschwitz, blah, 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 is suddenly confronted with their own moralizing expectations that such a person should not actually be coming out with such utterances. And it's a jolly good job he didn't go public with them, although ironically, of course, he did, because he then published the very statements that he's saying he can't go public with. So just to conclude, and coming back to some of the points that my colleagues raised, how far are we willing to go in our questioning? I think we like to think of ourselves in the humanities as willing to ask difficult questions. I think the institutional context in which we work in the humanities means that there are limits on the sorts of questions that can be asked. And I know for a fact that there are students who feel that there aren't questions that they can raise in the seminar room. So, this is all very good in theory, but are we actually able to carry out in practice the sort of questions that students might want to ask that don't conform to a sort of liberal left-leaning UCL, view of things? I remain slightly skeptical about that, unfortunately. The community of humanities that Emily spoke about with such conviction that it made me feel very old and jaded. I think perhaps that community of humanities is a limited one, and I don't know that it's very good at embracing difference for exactly the reasons we've heard. I myself find myself very unwilling to embrace the difference of certain currents in the current political world, shall we say, that I find reminiscent of the novels that I'm reading about National Socialism. I struggle to embrace those differences. I think that's all I would say, really, that I think in theory the humanities likes to think of itself as radical. I think in theory and within it, the books it writes, it's perhaps radical. And I think the pressure on being radical leads to such dubious assertions that we have by such thinkers as Zizek calling out that the act and the emphasis on the act, regardless of what follows, which frankly is quite reminiscent of certain political currents that we have at the moment. And if that's the sort of risk or courage we're talking about, then I'd rather not be associated with it. So, yeah, thank you.
I feel a bit like saying, see, I told you should be provocative. So thank you very much for that, Stephanie. I think there's an interesting sort of, almost three different layers going on as I was listening to you. One was, you talked about a writer that I also admire very much, Curtis, and in a way, the word that I think of, and maybe it's not a word that you would think was appropriate, but something about him being sort of unflinching, not just about the things that we might think he's unflinching about, which is all the horrors that he saw in various wars, etc., but about himself and about his own thoughts about things. And I think that unflinchingness is in itself is radical when one is reading him. You suggested that everybody go away and read his books. I would say do, but give yourselves a bit of time to digest them and sort of think about them, because they pack quite a punch, I think. The second thing is, I think the sort of nature of the way that you bring out the way you've read the books. And I think when we talk about the humanities, it's very interesting as we've been doing our inquiry. into the role of the humanities, it's very easy for us to do a sort of slippage and to make the defense of the humanities into a defense for literature, for example, or for films, whatever. That's not what the defense is about. The defense is about the fact that there are people who spend their time reading, interpreting, understanding these things. And there have been some comments here about the distinction between interpreting and embracing, which I think is right. I think that's right. I don't think we have to embrace all that we read, or all that we look at, or all that we think about. But I think you've demonstrated what it means to engage with text, and how that engagement can lead to a series of thoughts that in and of themselves start to become very provocative and very interesting. And I guess the third level is that then you reflect on that yourself. And some of your comments about the limits of our own radicalism, I think in themselves feel quite unflinching, and I'm sure will lead to lots and lots of debate. So I have to say thank you for that, because in a way, in a short space of time, you sort of encapsulate a lot of the things that, as we think about the role of the humanities, we need to take on board. So I'm very grateful to you. We've got one more speaker, and I think it was Tim who said that you'd chosen in a relay race. We chose the strongest runner at the beginning. We had a very strong runner, but we had very strong runners all the way through. I don't know what it says about the fact that Lee is our last runner, but I think I know Lee a little, because he's one of the panelists for the steering group for the inquiry into the value of the humanities, and I've always found him to be someone who's very thoughtful, provocative again. But he has the other virtue of having a really rather good sense of humour, so I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. He's Professor of Media History. He works on cinema, media and political economy. He's the author of a book called Cinema and the Wealth of Nations, Media, Capital and the Liberal World System. And he's currently working on colonial cinema and moving images of the British Empire, amongst other things. And I'm looking forward to what he has to say. So, Lee.
Thanks, Maurice. I guess you can hear me now.
Yes.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's really a pleasure to be here at the start of the second lockdown 2. I want to say, I'm going to speak quite quickly, I'll be honest with you, because I have quite a lot to say, so I'm sorry about that. I'll start with a few general statements. The humanities are a disinterested search for truths about humans and the human condition. I mean disinterested in specific ways. They're not connected to and shaped by markets, mostly in that humanities research is rarely tied to new technologies or business developments. Equally, humanities research is rarely directly in the service of government. And here is where distinctions can be drawn between the social and human sciences and the humanities, though I'm not looking up to open fissures in the joint faculties. Now, the humanities is not driven by the imperative then to make money and to find out things that governments want to know. Often the humanities are on the side of the powerless, and often work in the humanities values the ethical imperative to treat all humans as equal across time and space. Now, obviously, these are general observations, and often the humanities remains disinterested in the realities of oppression and suffering. Now, I'm duty-bound to say that that is okay, because it's imperative that knowledge be disinterested and free, so that we might admire the prose of the great writers, for example. But I do rather wonder how it is possible to be disinterested in the operations of power these days, in the chaos and crisis that surround us. In any case, my opening gambit proclaims simply that the humanities are valuable as a space outside of the logics of market and state. Now, I shall continue now with a single example to open up some pathways from the past to the present to inhabitable futures, as we've been asked to think about this evening. And the example is about information. In recent years, there has been a big data revolution, and lots of data is being gathered and used to learn new things. And often this is a very good thing. Any solution to COVID-19 will require lots of data gathering, sharing, and analysis. In funding calls that circulate around our university, we are urged to explore new ways to use data to solve societal problems and create new spin-off technologies and businesses. But I'm curious about the history and use of information. My curiosity expanded in 2016 when it emerged that new political entities have been gathering data about people in order to try to influence them in their political decision-making. Cambridge Analytica is the most well-known of these entities, though they are myriad. And Cambridge Analytica in particular was financed by a radical libertarian bent on stripping out governmental regulations, and was built out of a British psychological operations organization that was established in the early 1990s. And that was called Strategic Consulting Laboratories. And I'm going to abbreviate that as SCL. Now, Cambridge Analytica followed established practices to gather data, significantly that from Facebook, and to analyze this data for what it reveals about people. In this, the company built directly on social science research that had shown that the data people leave on Facebook can be mined to predict personality type. Cambridge Analytica, like all the advertisers who now use Google and Facebook, used this information to direct persuasive communication and media at people. And you probably recall that some of the most egregious examples of the use of this data in the US election of 2016 was around voter suppression. It turned out that Cambridge Analytica, working precisely together with Facebook, the Trump campaign, and the Republican Party, used this data to identify Black voters to try to dissuade them from voting. Now, it is a practice that seeks to degrade democracy, obviously, but note also that it is tied to the complex histories of racialization in a settler colony established later as a slaveholding democracy. Now, SCL had itself built on the histories of British imperial counterinsurgency, and they were effectively marketing this practice to those elites who were interested in shaping the future. This is colonial psyops as spin-out business venture. And in fact, the person who invented SCL claims to have been a UCL student. Now, the key discovery of the British imperial state as it fought guerrilla wars against decolonization in the 1950s and 1960s was that conventional military strategies failed. Rather, guerrilla or asymmetrical wars were better understood as information wars, necessitating new ways of garnering information about insurgents and populations that led to the development of new information technologies and practices. Many of these developments progressed in the US, obviously, after the development of the computer during World War II, as a way of using information to make complex predictions about the future. In subsequent years, accelerating during the asymmetrical war in Vietnam in particular, the US military developed computer networking and the first version of the internet, which was functional from 1969, largely as a mechanism to use information to combat insurgencies at home, and here one thinks of 1968, and of course abroad. In short, and compressing a lot of complex history here, the computer and its networking were central technologies in the development of new informational warfare. Now, bear in mind, too, that these counterinsurgent imperial practices are now the common business models of Google and Facebook, the two largest and most profitable media entities in the world. Google, for example, made $190 billion in 2019. That's 20 years after it was a PhD spin-off with seed money from the CIA. That's a pretty good spin-off for universities, I imagine. In this, then, we are all now insurgents. Now, the history that follows is dizzying, and I'm going to sketch it really quickly because I'm probably running out of time. Because of developments in microelectronics, computers grew smaller and spread widely in the 1970s. It sparked what is often called the information revolution. Because of the spread of computation and its networking, new possibilities in banking and finance capital developed. Computers enabled the processing of enormous amounts of data that could lead to predictions that could game markets. Some people became enormously wealthy because of this, and it sparked rapidly rising levels of inequality, both domestically and globally. In 2008, this model of deregulated financialization collapsed. Computers, it turns out, are not good at predicting events because mostly they predict the same as happened before. It is an odd dynamic of computational knowledge because data is utilized to make predictions, but those predictions can only be drawn from the history of what has happened. And so the future always looks like more of the past. Anyway, after the crash of 2008, governments bailed out banks and forced austerity on their populations, that's us, because the state is there to serve capital. In the ruins of this system, new radical right proto-fascist movements emerged, and a block of libertarian elites built new informational practices that helped them gain power. I loop back here to Cambridge Analytica, which was financed, as I said, by a libertarian finance capitalist who had a computer science PhD and who created this private psychological operations outfit largely to degrade government and its ability to raise taxation. My research oddly suggests that billionaire bankers spend a lot of time worrying about tax. Or another example, in Britain, the two groups campaigning to leave the EU use Cambridge Analytica to garner data and to unleash forms of informational warfare to facilitate their political and economic interests. Mostly that was around the deregulation of capital, but as you will know, it was also tied to white nationalism and the policing of refugee and migrant movement. The campaigns were powered, the two Leave EU campaigns were powered by dark money that comes from transatlantic libertarian networks and probably from Russia, but the delayed government report on that precisely redacts that information. The campaign, one of the campaigns released 1.5 billion dark ads through Facebook using behavioral data and dark money in the last week of the referendum campaign, and have been found guilty of purposefully breaking electoral law around the sharing and use of data by the British Information Commission Office. But no matter, because the people who did this, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, and Dominic Cummings, are now the government of this country. I'm afraid to break the news to you, though many of you probably already know this, that our government is an illegal, corrupt regime that purposefully broke electoral laws to degrade democracy to advance their interests. Now, in a crazy plot twist, this bunch of corrupt libertarians who are against government are in government during a global emergency that requires government. Anyway, to conclude, and this is really quick, I'm sorry, this is my last point. As our world descends into crisis and chaos amid accelerating planetary emergencies that Emily started talking about, but that are ignored in the daily scandals and outrages that form our media screens, the humanities offers a critical space outside of the demands of markets and government, a space that can value the human and be largely unconcerned with metrics and markets. Now, of course, this idealized space is only partly true. The university where the humanities precariously reside has itself been constructed as a market entity, a process that speeded up across the 1970s and again more recently with the introduction of fees. Now we are a different kind of information industry ourselves that charges our young people to have access to the histories of knowledge passed down from generation to generation, turned into a market, a consumer object that can be judged on the basis of metrics, rankings, ratings, refs, and all that nonsense. All the things that destroy education and its possibilities in the name of measuring them. I value the humanities then because it can help us, the humans, resist datafication and the machines and find new ways to be together in the world. Thank you.
Lee, thank you so much, it's a wonderful, another wonderful provocation, another good example of the way in which humanities thinking can kind of connect with the world as we're experiencing it right now, I think something that we're all. I suppose you've sort of brought together an articulation of lots of things that we all feel in the back of our minds, but in some ways, that's what humanities type thinking does so well, to make arguments out of things that perhaps we can't quite articulate the rest of the time. And it's often the role of humanities scholars to bring those things together, even whether we agree with them or not. So thank you. I found that extraordinary and really rather wonderful. Now, the panelists have been kind of chatting away amongst themselves while we've all been listening, and there's a suggestion that because it's now 20 past and we were supposed to finish at past, we might go on for a little bit longer, because the feeling was that the panelists hadn't done too shabbily and actually gone rather well, and actually we might want to just carry on a bit more. And I think I'm rather supportive of that. Of course, if we lose some people along the way, I'll totally understand that. But I'm going to suggest that we take just a few more minutes, if that's okay, just so that we can get a bit of a discussion going. Now, if you are, if you're not one of the panelists and you would like to participate in the discussion, we would very much like you to do so. There's a good, healthy list of contributions already. Can you remember to click all panelists and participants in the bar, so that when you're communicating with everybody? Because I think what's nice about this last section is that I think we should all try and talk together. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to ask some questions of panelists, but I would be very interested to see if participants also have answers to the questions, because I think part of the point of these sorts of discussions is that they should be discussions. It's hard for us to do them in these strange circumstances, online, etc. If we were all in a room together, we could wave our arms and kind of, you know, show through our body language that we want to talk and all the rest of it. It's very difficult, but let's try, if we can, to make it work. I guess one of the things that I wanted to do, and it may seem rather trivial, but I think it's a sort of question that someone outside the academy might be interested in, and so I think we should ask ourselves it at the moment, which is, and in a way it follows on very well from what Lee's saying. So, you know, I think for every, you know, I'm old enough to have seen lots and lots of different moments of history. I'm getting on a bit. And you know, every time, you know, have a different period of history, we all think, good God, this is different from anything else we've ever been through. Well, this time it does feel a bit different. I mean, here we all are stuck at home, and with a pretty extraordinary set of political circumstances in this country and in other countries, which are important on the world stage, and people are frightened. People are frightened about their health. They're frightened about the politics around them. They're frightened about what's going on with our environment. People are frightened. And one of the questions being asked by many disciplines is, you know, not just the humanities, but, you know, what's the role? What's the role of a university? What's the role of disciplines in all of this? And some disciplines are being thrust into the public eye. Not only medicine at the moment, but also statistics has been thrust into the public eye. So one of the things that I would love to ask the panelists is, what do you think the sort of special call to action is for the humanities in this moment, if anything at all? Is this a moment in which, as humanities scholars, we ought to think about our contribution to some of the big debates that are going on? And obviously, we've had some contributions already today. I'm not sure if people can people put their hands up in the panel, or I might just call people out if that's okay. I might start with Benedetto. Can I start with you, or you can shake your head if you'd rather I didn't start with you? And you're saying no. Tim, I'll start with you. You're fairly reliable. I think you'll just say yes, won't you? Go on then.
No, Emily had her hand up. Let's go to Emily.
Oh, did she? I couldn't see it. I'm really sorry. Emily, I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't know whether you were going to call on people. I just put my hand up because I was thinking about it.
I realised I didn't know where to look to see where hands are up. I'm sorry. I'll figure it out.
Yeah. No. So I put my physical hand up, so it might just be the way the screens were organised. But yeah, I think what this pandemic. I think I completely agree with your initial point about it. Every era think that they're undergoing an unprecedented level of crisis. And I was reading the start of the Hannah Arendt Truth and Politics test, and she said, you know, no one has ever doubted that truth and politics are on rather bad terms with each other, and no one has ever counted truthfulness amongst political virtues. And we just think, well, that's got to be talking about exactly now, as every era has sort of thought that it's been the case in a way. But there have been differences, and there's been moments of, you know, unprecedented violence throughout the 20th century in different times and spaces. And now I think you're right to say that the biggest difference is the circumstances we all find ourselves in now, which is isolating from one another in a way that is unique. And what it has shown is that people are able to change their behaviors in radical ways very quickly. And so we actually have a moment of opportunity, you know, and a case study of a time when people are able to radically transform the way they live. And in many ways, we have to be at the center of the story, creation of a story of how to move forward from this point, and not just go back to business as usual. I mean, this has been said in loads of different spheres. I would direct everyone to the, there was a great, the UCL podcast that's been running all the way through, dealing precisely with, I can't remember the title of it now, but coronavirus UCL kind of thing. There was an absolutely fantastic episode of that was a bunch of different experts from different areas talking about how we need to just start a conversation with health at the heart of it now, and we need to move forward with mindful of all of the inequality that the systems have produced, and kind of reconfigure the whole global order to not have capital, as Lee would absolutely agree with, at the heart of all the states and decision making and powerful processes that are going on. So I think it's the time to just try and ferret our way into any sphere to be able to say that kind of thing, really. I mean, that's where I'm not pretending to have the answer, but I do think there is an opportunity here.
And when you say ferret our way, how does this ferreting happen? What do you imagine the nature of a ferreting is? How does it? What should we do? Because I think again, it's an interesting question. And by the way, people in lots of, I mean, we were talking before about all different games. There are lots of different disciplines, people from different walks of life, and I think everyone's asking themselves the question: what should I be doing? What should I do? And so you suggest that it sounds provocative and appealing. So what do you think it looks like?
Well, I mean, Maurice, you sound the closest to all of us in having access to these people, of power, the bankers and the statesmen and the politicians and all sorts. I mean, one way is
are you putting it all on me? Is it all? It's all my responsibility.
No, I'm saying. I mean, I think what Benedetto said was absolutely correct, and that's that we all have to state our position, and in some ways, we can never escape our position. We're not partisan when we do that, but we are in a certain sphere, and often our impact can only be to then state our informed intellectual position in the company of people who do then have other spheres of action in which they can intervene. So if Benedetto knows that there is slavery in a certain context and can name that and denounce it for what it is, which is abominable, then if she can say that in the company of somebody who then can have international law be waged against them to say that this is under the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we're looking to end human slavery, then that's that it's not to back out of the conversation, but we do have to be having conversations with diverse people. That's what we're talking about when we have to have embodied interaction. As virtual as we are now, we sort of have to have conversations with as many diverse people as we can, and find those avenues through which change can be made, basically.
I don't know if anyone else wants to kind of come in here on the idea of having as many conversations as we can. Stephanie, what's your view on this? Do you think that the humanities scholars would do well to find ways to have conversations outside what Tim calls the game, or do you think that there's a sort of difficulty or that problematic in some way? How do you see that?
Yeah, I think we would benefit from having those conversations, actually, because I think it's very easy to get caught. Well, I find it very easy to get caught up in what I find interesting in writing, and the subtleties, what I like to think of as nuances and so on. And other people have very different concerns. I mean, I've been doing an obvious conversation that I've been involved in recently has been doing quite a lot of so-called impact work with teachers to see if our work on perpetrators and complicity, if there's any way of getting that into the school curriculum by doing continued professional development events with teachers who are teaching Nazi history. And they just have completely different concerns than the ones that I wouldn't have than I would have imagined. For example, they have about 4 hours to teach the whole of National Socialism. Many of their students don't have the first clue about what a perpetrator beyond Hitler might even be. So the sort of interesting questions we think we're asking, we can barely even get to that point, and that has brought home the extent to which we are having conversations with our academic community, but seeing what other people's priorities are, I think, is very sobering from that point of view. And yes, it would be it is important, I think, to have those conversations. I rather wish it weren't under the label of impact. I wish it were public out, what's it called? Knowledge transfer. I'm much more comfortable with. I think that's valuable in and of itself.
Yes. I've always loathed the word impact too. It makes you think of an accident impact, but anyway.
Yeah. Well,
but I guess broadening that out, Alexander Murphy asked a question which was about the role of universities in the UK, and so beyond just beyond the humanities, because it does broaden out this. It is what is the role of the humanities in all of this? I don't know, Stephanie, did you have anything you'd like to add on that point, and where you think our sector is going, the whole of this sector? And Benedetto,
yeah, can I say something quick about that?
Yes,
which is that I don't feel optimistic about the way the universities are going because of the constant drive to becoming a business. I don't think under the current political climate that is going to shift, and I'm sorry to say that I think the way the university leadership has itself sort of gone along with the differentiation between the new and the old universities, and then the Russell Group has created an internal hierarchy, and there's also internal competition instead of actually holding together as a sector, to use their vocabulary, and actually resisting, which should have been done 20 years ago. It's very difficult to know what the universities can now do to reverse it, and to reverse the onus on acting like a business. Can I just say one thing that has made me think very hard about the university as an institution, and that's a book I read by a sociologist of institutions called Stefan Kuhl, who's written a book called Normal Organizations, where he has analysed from a sociology point of view the way in which institutions like the police, for example, that's his particular object of inquiry, how they shifted. He refers to the zone of indifference that is present in any institution, where all of us have bits of our work which fall into this zone of indifference, where we don't know when we start our jobs. We're not very concerned with the sort of admin that will come because it's not written into our job description. And over time, the zone of indifference itself shifts. So you could be a policeman in Hamburg and end up shooting people into graves. And it's often made me think about the way when I started the job in the university in 1994, I was not yet working as a border agency person for the British, is it Home Office or Foreign Office, whatever it is that we're working for. But now all of us, through the bureaucratic process of having to keep lists and registers, we have in effect, our job has changed to become part of a border surveillance. And that is, I think, worrying, and yet here we are all doing it. So, I mean, it just brings home how easy it is to see the way institutions will shift over time, and we go along with it because we are part of that institution.
No, and I think you make a very good point. I can see from the comments that a lot of people share your anxieties. I'll just, before coming on to Benedetto, I'll just make one point about business, because I operate in the world of business. The thing that makes me, that astonishes me really about universities is that they try to adopt a model of the way businesses work that businesses themselves have moved away from about 40 years ago. And so it's a notion of the way businesses work that never actually worked for businesses. And in some ways, the businesses that I work for are trying to get closer to the way universities used to operate when they had things like notions about protecting things like freedom of speech, etc. Which is it's a very curious thing. But I think your points are well made. There's a question for you, Stephanie, about perhaps putting the title of the book in the chat, if that's okay. Benedetto, let me come on to you, because then you did want to speak. So
yeah, I think a lot of the questions that we're seeing come up and the discussions we're having go back to the issue of how do we combine an attempt to carry out a rigorous analysis And that analysis has to be non-partisan. And I don't know if everybody agrees on that. And by that, I do not mean that we can take the bird's eye view, the God's view of the story. I mean, I'm entirely with Donna Haraway. We all have partial perspectives that are dictated by our position in the world. But there is a great difference between writing a historiography, for example, or perhaps a literary analysis that takes sides with certain people and represents those we don't agree with as fundamentally and intrinsically wrong. That stance, that kind of partisanship, is a denial to an attempt to make an exegesis of where this other who has a stance different from ours is coming from, of how they have reached their particular positions, even if that position is one of perpetrator. I think as people coming from the kind of analysis that I'm interested in is an analysis that allows me to understand where they're coming from, that treats them, and by them I mean victims and perpetrators, the so-called victim, as exegetes themselves. Just like I am an exegete and a positioned one, I recognize that a victim and a perpetrator are exegetes. That is, they are constantly interpreting, they have an intellectual strategy. And I can't make sense of their intellectual strategies unless I try and interpret the world they come from. They have a political strategy, and I can't make sense of their political strategy unless I start doing a language analysis of the word they're using, the term they're using, what does it mean? What are the moral connotations of their ways of understanding their own actions in the context they inhabit? Now, doing this kind of interpreting work requires me to take not a partisan stance where I think, well, this person says just crap. I just don't take any of this crap. This is, it requires me to engage the so-called truth of the other, with truth in big inverted commas. At the same time as I'm doing that, I'm also revealing my positioning. That is my point of view. So there has to be that. I think otherwise, and not only I think there has to be that, but I think that is, at least in my view, and I respect other views, but I've been critical of the sort of impact agenda because it has lost sense that this should be what we as academics are accountable for. I have to provide, first and foremost, a critical and rigorous analysis and interpretation. I have to justify it. I have to root it in this whole exegesis of the language of the other, of the times of the other, of the political strategies of the other, and that in itself is difficult. And there is an expectation in some quarters that all we are good for is to help the activist. And then we are judged by a little letter that the activist is supposed to write for our impact case studies that says that, yeah, in fact, we were helpful. Now, that is actually a problem in terms of our integrity, because if I must prove the utility of my analysis on the basis of what the activist thinks, this is likely to corrupt the analyst, who will then have to do something that pleases that activist. If my critique of DFID will anger the FID, and if my whole purpose is going to be judged by a letter written by the FID, just to take an example, then I'm not going to be impartial. I'm not going to be critical. I'm not going to be critical when needed. I'm not going to start, unveiling their truths and their non-truths and their escamotage. So in this, I think it's absolutely central to what we do and has to stay central to what we do, whether we like it or not. And sometimes we may not like it. Sometimes we would much rather prefer to stand out there and scream our own truths. But I don't think we have to do it, or we should do it in our analytical work. Yet that's not the only hat we can wear. We can also go out and scream our own perspective, which will be hopefully informed by that work of critical analysis and exegesis. We can take stances and say where we stand when it comes to casting a vote. And that exercise is political and different from the academic game, to go back to games.
Great points, and I love some of the emphasis, if you like, on the responsibility or the accountability of the academic there. I'm sure that could be contested territory, but it seems like an important topic. We don't have time to kind of get into it, but it just seems like such an important point here. I noticed in the chat that Florian has said, you know, are we giving up important territory and not talking about the importance of reading closely? And then I think there's something that says perhaps Stephanie would be on your side. I don't know if Stephanie is or not, but I am too. And I think other people on this panel would be. If we haven't mentioned it, then I think don't worry, Florian. I think you're in good company. I actually think all the panelists in different ways have made an argument for reading closely, not necessarily reading literary texts, but reading text closely. I think all the panelists have. You know, to me, if I step outside the academy for a moment, I think, what has this experience been like? Because I spent much of my life outside of the academy. I think the refreshing thing about this has been, to some extent, about the power of reading in its broader sense, the power of what it means to look at things critically and read carefully. And it seems to me that all the panelists have talked about that, and that is a very good thing. We don't have very much more time, and I realize that but you see Stephanie wants to get in there again. Yes, Stephanie, and then we're going to have to stop, I'm afraid. But
yeah, I just want to remind everybody that a lot of people who are complicit with structures that support atrocity, love reading, may even be humanities graduates. I don't know where law stands in the wider definition of humanities. Is law a humanity? No.
I don't think it is.
Okay, that's okay then. But
are you feeling better now?
I am feeling slightly better, yes,
Right.
because a lot of very high up and important National Socialists were law graduates, even with PhDs.
But they were also people who listened to Schubert and read wonderful poetry and all the rest of it. So I mean, I think those arguments, arguments that we know. I don't think there's a direct correlation between, you know, reading or even reading well and being a good human being. I think we're making a case for reading critically, which isn't necessarily the same as being moral or ethical. Anyway, but we should probably leave it there. Do write in the chat anything you feel about this session and whether I've seen that some people have said that they've enjoyed it already, but do let us know, because I think it's nice for us to hear that. I'm going to thank our fantastic panelists. I genuinely learnt things today. I mean, I share things occasionally and think, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that. I really enjoyed this one, so I thought it was great. All of the contributions were superb and very varied, but I thought they fitted together very well. I suppose I should leave the last word to James, because he kicked us off. So maybe I'll let him close this off. But many thanks to everybody, and also for staying a little bit later. I think it was worth it, the extra 15 minutes. We squeezed a bit more out of everybody. So many thanks. And I hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
So, well, just a final goodbye from me, and thanks again to all the panelists and to Maurice, to Jessica, and all the team who've made all these fantastic events for the Inspiring Minds season possible. And well, let us know what you've thought of the whole programme, as it's been an experiment for us in the faculty to do something to launch the year with a bang, and to put on a series of interdisciplinary events which will bring together students and staff from across the faculty in order to think about the humanities. And we hope you've enjoyed the events, and if you've missed any of the ones that have happened already, then they'll be up on the website. You can see them. And just, well, good night and thank you very much indeed.